Good evening and hello and welcome, dear viewers. This is Cases. 2 years after the revolution that overthrew Zain al-Abidin bin Ali, press freedom in Tunisia slid backward. Since the newly elected government assumed office in January, the authorities took several worrying steps that included the appointment of government allies as the new heads of state television, radio and print outlets. In April, 3 journalists were beaten while covering a protest. And in July, police officers attacked also 2 journalists who were filming a collision involving a police cruiser and a train. In August, the authorities issued an arrest warrant for the head of a private television station, Ben Ali Ally, who also hosted a show mocking current government figures. In February, the authorities detained and fined 3 journalists for publishing a nude photo. Journalists said the government was ignoring 2 media laws adopted in November 2011 that were modeled on international press freedom standards, instead enforcing the previous repressive laws. And today, many journalists strike in Tunisia as media members continue to express concerns over what they consider government efforts to limit press freedom. These include arrest of journalists, allegations of bias in government appointments to state media outlets, and accusations that laws protecting media freedom are not properly enforced. For more on this topic, we are joined in the studio by Mr. Manuel Orchsenreiter, a journalist and editor-in-chief of Zuerst news magazine, and from Tunisia with Dr. Amna Guellali, the Tunisia Office Director at Human Rights Watch. Hello and welcome, Manuel, to Cases.
Thank you.
Before starting our conversation, we will take a look at a report that will give us information about the status of journalists before the revolution took place in Tunisia. Dear viewers, we will watch and be right back.
Sarcastically, journalists in Tunisia face arrest and torture in the country whose people rose against the monopoly of governance, demanding democracy and pluralism. In response to the unemployment Tunisians were passing through, Mohamed Bouazizi, the jobless Tunisian, set himself afire in December 2010, launching protests across Tunisia and introducing himself as a revolutionary icon. Following the death of Bouazizi, various groups of political and human rights activists, labor and trade unionists, students, professors, lawyers, and others who were dissatisfied with the existing system sought unification and began an uprising targeting the regime of Ben Ali. At the time of Ben Ali's regime, journalists and media served as official mouthpieces, and the revolution did not come just to the streets, but to media and journalism as well.
On n'a pas de médias en Tunisie, on a des marionnettes, on a des médias qui travaillent, qui sont manipulés par l'État.
After the ouster of Ben Ali's regime, a Tunisian journalist said, "We were reflecting the dictator's vanity, and our words were empty." Journalists in La Presse, one of the most prestigious Tunisian newspapers published in French, called the managing director he used to represent the old regime and asked him not to come in. Now, what was the condition of journalists and media in Tunisia at the time of Ben Ali's ruling? Victimization, abduction, and detention characterized the status of journalists at the time, and the actions taken by the authorities were enforced into the legal system. Indeed, the government of Tunisia, before the uprising of January 2011, utilized laws, regulations, and surveillance to achieve strict control over the internet and the press. For example, journalists have been prosecuted by Tunisia's press code, which bans offending the president, disturbing order, and publishing what the government perceives as false news. The government also used to restrict the media by controlling the registration of print media and licensing of broadcasters, refusing permission to critical outlets, and controlling the distribution of public sector advertisement. Moreover, journalists were also charged in courts with vague violations of the penal code.
Actually, Manuel, one of the journalists that were interviewed before the revolution took place and asked about the condition of journalists within Tunisia. And he said that we were unable to write articles speaking about the pains and the suffering and the needs of the Tunisian people. However, now, because we were obliged to only write articles pro the government or to the government. In brief words, Manuel, how would you describe the way that journalists acted before the revolution took place and their condition back then?
I think we witness in the pre-revolutionary Tunisia, I think a very normal, what we expect from a normal dictatorship. In an open dictatorship, the government says what to write, the journalists write, and it does censorship, it controls the book publishing, it controls the news publishing, it gives licenses, it takes licenses back if the media is not obedient, it punishes journalists, it puts journalists into jail. So these are all things not very surprising, but what we expect.
Yes, pure dictatorship community, and that's
exactly.
Like Libya, what took place, and Egypt before the revolution took place.
I'm not pretty much sure how it functioned there very exactly, but we know the Tunisian press codex from 1975, where very precisely is said that it's not allowed to criticize the president, it's not allowed to criticize officials and official figures. It was, let me say it as a journalist like that, more or less a very honest dictatorship in terms of freedom of press, because it didn't even claim that there is a real freedom of press. It said you are not allowed to do this or that, and you are punished if you do this or that.
As you highlighted a very important point here. From your perspective as a journalist today, Manuel, when we speak about the way that these journalists lived before the revolution took place, as in that they should abide by the red lines, number one, write only about the government, number two, do not even speak about any kind of harassments or any kind of abuse for these citizens by the government or even by security forces. How do you feel? Do you feel that when freedom of expression is banned, therefore a community does not exist? To that extent, do you view it?
It's a very clear red line for the community, this press codex of 75. It's a very clear red line for any journalist, and it does something else to the journalist. It doesn't just make the journalist to be obedient towards the government, it makes something worse to any journalist. It makes him self-censorship.
Yes.
This is the question, how far can I go? And before I even don't want to touch this red line. So what comes out at the end is a hip hip hooray reportage about so great is our government, we don't have any problems. So this is the media image, what comes out at the end, and the colleagues who are not obedient have to migrate, to go to the exile, or they have to face a hardcore punishment. We are speaking not about low punishments, we are speaking about 5-year sentences, 7-year sentences of colleagues serving in prison just because of writing things not being allowed by the government.
And as you highlighted, one of the hardest aspects is self-censorship.
Yes.
Because of course the journalist here knows what the red lines are, despite the fact that he wants to write more or not. How come we hardly heard about the pain of these Tunisian journalists before the revolution here, Manuel, or correct me if I'm wrong, have we actually read enough articles or enough reports issued speaking about the condition of these journalists even before the revolution took place? It was even difficult for the information to be transmitted to the public even.
Yes, of course, but it is also a sort of, let me say it like this, I think the international journalist community tries to protect the colleagues working in a certain country. So what you are not doing, you are not interviewing a colleague from Tunisia. We're speaking now pre-revolutionary under Ben Ali, interviewing him, and he will not complain in your media about the circumstances of his work because you will bring him in trouble. But what was by that time, of course, and I knew that because we're working as well on those issues, the problem was well known. There were several journalist NGOs mentioning the problem. I think there was the Tunisia monitoring project, or I don't remember the main. They were even before the revolution, they had I think 18 recommandments for the Tunisian government what shall stop for freedom of speech. So there was a lobby for those journalists, lobbying for their work, that they can do their work. I think this took place, although it was not so present in mainstream media. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Joined by Amna Guellali, the Tunisia Office Director at Human Rights Watch. Hello and welcome, Amna, to Cases.
Thank you very much. Hello.
Amna, is it much different what we're seeing now from what happened or what the status of journalists was before the revolution took place? Because in order to understand the condition that they are in today, we need to at least know how much they suffered in the past before the revolution took place.
Yes, the terms in which we describe the situation of the journalists before the revolution is quite accurate. There were plenty and scores of laws that were adopted by the former regime in order to stifle dissent and repress journalists and prevent them from speaking freely. There was also the judiciary, which was acted as the instrument of the former regime in order to put some journalists in jail and also prosecute them for their writings. This has created a situation of really very hard repression against the journalists in Tunisia, also through the control that the former regime had on the audiovisual sector, but also on the written press.
They were only jailed up to your own information, Amna, or they were subjected even to various kinds of torture?
Well, torture was quite pervasive. There was, I think, a practice and widespread pattern of torture. Also, journalists were also subjected to torture, for sure. There are several cases reported by human rights organizations and by international NGOs about torture in Tunisian prisons against opponents. These opponents can be from across the political spectrum. They could be from the Islamists, but also from more secularists journalists, and they were both subjected to torture.
Of course, I wanted to ask about, according to what law were they judged, these journalists we're speaking about before the revolution, but to have more information about the penal code that was actually followed and still followed. Articles 125 and 128 of Tunisia's penal code punish those who insult public officials in connection with the exercise of their functions or suggest that a public official has committed a legal act without establishing the veracity of such claims. Article 86 of the Telecommunications Law, under which knowingly causing prejudice to another person or disturbing their peace via the public telecommunications network, is punishable by imprisonment for 1 to 2 years and a fine of 100 to 1,000 dinars. Article 57 of Decree Law number 115 on media freedom, under which any form of attack on the dignity of another person, term of contempt or insult not involving a specific allegation, is punishable by a fine of 500 to 1,000 dinars. Now, of course, speaking more about the laws that were followed in judging journalists back then, of course, speaking still before the revolution, even if some of these articles were amended and are still followed now inside Tunisia after the revolution. Were they judged upon certain articles found in the penal code or according to certain constitution here?
Sorry, I didn't really understand the question. Are you talking about before or after the revolution?
Yes, before the revolution. If these journalists were to be jailed, were they to be jailed according to certain penal code or according to certain articles found within the Tunisian constitution before it was demolished or even amended?
Well, it was a whole system, a whole set legal arsenal of repression that was used by the Tunisian authorities in order to bring charges against journalists, bloggers and others. be it from the top of the Tunisian legal order. So the constitution guaranteed freedom of expression, but left to the law the remit for determining what the freedom of expression meant. So the legislators and the parliament could draft and enact laws that were against freedom of expression. And this is precisely what happened. We had like a legislation which was rife with several articles which were used as a tool of repression, be it in the penal code as those articles that you have just referred to, but also in the press code. There is a press code that was also had a lot of articles which criminalized free speech, from the insult to the president, to harming public order and morals in media, to other kind of acts such as spreading false information. All those articles could lead journalists to jail and to prosecution.
So therefore, Manuel, we're not speaking about a regime that would like to actually harass or even jail journalists for expressing their opinion, but the regime is simply following laws and following a constitution that at one point, as Amna described, was harsh by itself here. So the problem is within the constitution itself and within these articles and within the press laws, as Amna actually highlighted.
Yeah, this is what I want to say. There are these red lines, they are visible, and it is what we expect from a sort of dictatorship. Very simple. What we face in any dictatorship.
Yes, it's because of these constitutions.
Exactly, they give those laws, and they say, so in that point it is legal to prosecute journalists.
What cannot be legalized.
Exactly. Yeah.
Of course, we'll continue our conversation, dear viewers. We will take a short break and be right back. Stay tuned.
Beyond the lines, beyond the surface. Depth, clarity, substance. Beyond the discourse.
Beyond politics, beyond the shallowness of everyday politics.
Dear viewers, welcome back. Again, we will watch another report that would give us information about the status of journalists after the revolution took place, after they worked really hard for toppling or ousting regime of Zain al-Abidin bin Ali. Manuel, watch the report and be right back. Dear viewers, stay tuned.
The condition of the press in Tunisia and the status of journalists as well were not encouraging as expression of views. Whether in press or via internet, it was restricted by harsh laws and regulations. Right after the ouster of Ben Ali, journalists breathed a sigh of relief, and the country's media has taken to its new freedoms with stunning speed. The pervasive ruling party of President Zain al-Abidin bin Ali has disappeared, the watchful intelligence minders have vanished, and the dreaded Ministry of Information, which was considered as the country's censor, has been abolished. However, as the Islamists, in particular Ennahda party, got into power, allegations of systematic repression and detention of Tunisian journalists has risen in mainstream media and also went viral on social media. The latest was the allegation of detaining the journalist Ziad al-Hani by using illegal procedures, according to Tunisian judges. Indeed, the authorization of his imprisonment was the straw that broke the camel's back.
مناش ساكتين باش نواصلوا تعبير ما نحيناش ما نحيناش بن علي اللي كان يقول لنا ممنوع باش نحطوا اليوم شكل آخر يقول لنا حرام، حرام وحلال ولا حرام والحلال عنا نحن ماهوش موضوع ثورتنا، موضوع ثورتنا الكرامة والحرية.
As a response to what is so-called repressive measures against freedom of press and expression in Tunisia, in addition to what they called the illegal capture of Ziad al-Hani, the National Union of Tunisian Journalists went for a strike in September 2013, protesting the restrictions imposed on press by the Islamist-led government. It is important to know that media rights are theoretically governed by 2 decrees adopted after the revolution, designed to guarantee press freedom and regulate audiovisual media. In light of these incidents in Tunisia, with the Islamist-led government and the judiciary system ruin what most of Tunisians suffered from and fought to gain,
des vraies reconstructurations dans la vie politique, on ne peut rien faire. Et on va revenir à une autre 14 janvier, une autre révolution, et encore le sang des Tunisiens va se couler.
Okay, Manuel, how has the journalists in Tunisia, and amid all the censorship that they have, or even self-censorship as you highlighted, how did they participate in one way or another in toppling the regime of Zain al-Abidin bin Ali? What was the role of journalists specifically?
I think the journalists played in that point an important role also to do a lot of networking also of the groups, and of course to bring out the news beside the bloggers, beside the social media, to bring out the news about there is an uprising taking place in Tunisia. Maybe we wouldn't have known without journalists and without those brave people who were bringing out those news. I think their role, we shouldn't underestimate the role, and when we see that after Ben Ali had to leave his office, that there was a sort like blooming of media, all of the sudden new media, and they were like it was like a laboratory. They were trying a lot of new things and testing in all means. It was all of the sudden it was breaking out
as if at one point we actually saw them enhancing the role of the social media.
Yes.
And of course of the cyber media, and whether through blogging, or did they actually depend on that for calling even for strike and demonstrations within Tunisia and during the era of the revolution?
This is an interesting question. What role exactly do social media play? And we know in the meantime also that just cheering to social media is not so easy, because social media can also be abused and by whoever, by what pressure group ever. But we have to see that in Tunisia especially, there were also those measures by the Ben Ali government against bloggers, against social media users. So whatever hit a journalist could have happened to any blogger, any social media user who was publishing on his own responsibility news of this country. So we shouldn't forget this also. The role it played maybe was important for making it also international known.
Definitely,
what took place.
And that would of course place an international pressure on the regime to actually lead to its toppling or even to its ousting. How do you view the working condition today, Manuel, of journalists inside Tunisia? Have they actually gained all of the rights that they should be given now?
In theory, I think maybe it's surprising for you or for the audience. I consider the situation now in Tunisia much more dramatic as during the Ben Ali era, because what we said is the Ben Ali era was a dictatorship, the red lines, the laws. It was clear for a journalist. You are not obedient, you end up in prison, you are punished. Now we have to do with a hypocrisy. We have a government which claims to be the revolutionary government, and the revolution was not just an Islamic revolution, as the Ennahda party says. It was a social revolution, it was a liberal revolution, it was a revolution also for civil rights. So they claim all this and adopt all this, but what takes place in reality, then this is the hypocrisy, is that journalists still end up in prison. But now they lie to the journalists. They tell them, you can write what you want, you look, we are a liberal country, but at the end, a movie maker films somebody throwing an egg against the minister, and he ends up with the police. So,
okay. Now, do you agree here with Mr. Manuel? Do you agree that the position of journalists today has not pretty much exceeded or accelerated or become a better place for journalists in Tunisia? They still face difficulties here. Do you agree with Mr. Manuel?
I think the situation of journalists in Tunisia and the situation of the media in general is very paradoxical. While on the one hand we can say with confidence that there is much more freedom of expression, that there is more pluralism, let's say, in the media field, that people can express their opinions and voice it in a very ferocious way sometimes and even be very critical of the government. However, as it was accurately said and very expressed by your guest, there is indeed it's very unclear to understand what are the red lines. The red lines are very fluctuant, they are very fluent, they can move from one place to another, and it is very surprising to see that we still have today in Tunisia people that can be put in jail and sentenced for a word that they have written in a press article, for an artwork deemed offensive, or for a blog or a Facebook post. These are all real cases that have happened in Tunisia during the course of these last months and have really increased the concern of civil society groups and other observers about the situation of freedom of expression, particularly freedom of the journalists. The problem here is that although there are new laws that apply, so the press code, as it was rightly said in your reportage, the press code has been changed. There is a new code for the press and code for the audiovisual media. However, we still have the same legal arsenal in the penal code which applies, which is, as I said before, rife with a lot of articles criminalizing freedom of expression. And there is a kind of arbitrariness in which the judiciary is using these laws. So when a journalist writes something, he never knows whether what he wrote will be, he will be safe after he wrote, or whether he will be charged and sent to jail.
But to what extent do you believe that... Amna, to what extent do you believe that the story of Ziad Al-Hani, of course he was freed on a bail, but to what extent was the story the starting point of like more news to come in from Tunisia concerning journalists? To what extent has the story shed the light on some of the harassments that these journalists are subjected to today inside Tunisia?
The story of Ziad Al-Hani is only one in the spate of attacks against freedom of expression in Tunisia. And as I said, there are journalists, but there are other people who are also under the Damocles sword of these laws. The same day that Ziad Al-Hani, who was charged for criticizing the prosecutor, the public prosecutor, for having used false evidence against a person, the same day that he was prosecuted and charged for that, there were 3 other cases of the same type, and 3 other people also prosecuted, 1 journalist and 1 union leader. There are bloggers also who have come under the, this repression, let's say, from the authorities. So we have seen this trend, and it's quite surprising that we are still seeing people who are prosecuted for their opinion.
Of course, here we can take a look of how other newspapers reacted towards the, of course, the arrestment of Ziad Al-Hani. A lot of the newspapers had headlines, and of course, concerning the issue, amid the call for a strike to protest pressure imposed on journalists on September 2013, after a reporter was arrested for accusing the public prosecutor of fabricating evidence against a cameraman. The country's newspapers all ran with headlines announcing the strike. For example, Le Temps newspaper said, Tunisian journalists are sick and tired, but they are not giving up. We have Le Quotidien newspaper said, the battle for freedom of expression rages. La Presse said, they can stifle freedom, they can restore the rule of terror insidiously, but the warning shots of revolt will be heard. Manuel, to what extent is the support of the rest of the media important to any journalist who's kidnapped or even arrested by the government? This kind of support that Tunisian local and dominant newspapers actually, when speaking about these arrestments, what does it mean today?
It's for a journalist, for arrested journalist, is this sort of solidarity, which means also publicity to outside, might be the life insurance even. So, so the world knows that he is arrested or that what is going on. I think this is a very important thing, and for those colleagues inside Tunisia, for the Tunisian media who are publishing about this, this means also they take a personal risk about publishing about those things happening. Yes, of course.
And of course, Amna said that this raised kind of the notice of civil society, definitely, and not only newspapers reacted to the case, but also civil. Amna, for more on this, Amna, how did the people actually react towards the arrestment of this journalist, despite the fact that newspapers were purely supportive of journalists and the freedom of press or press freedom? But how did the rest of the Tunisian citizens reacted towards this?
There were mixed reactions, I think, but mostly reactions of support, because the fact that Tunisians are really very, they want to have freedom of expression. They have fought for that during the revolution, and it's considered as one of the main gains of the revolution. There were no other major changes in terms of socio-economic rights and you know, improvements in terms of the poverty and the economic situation. However, freedom of expression is considered as one of the gains, and I think people are very, very reluctant to give up on any of these you know, spaces which were gained after the revolution in this sense. So I think civil society was also very supportive of all the journalists and other people who were charged for offenses, for speech offenses.
Yes, and obviously they went into the streets and they launched strikes and demonstrations in support of these journalists arrested by the government. And that by itself probably raised awareness along the region and allowed journalists who are not Tunisian along the region to actually be noticing these kind of harassments and these kinds of arrests. So obviously the arrestment of Zain al-Hadi is one of the major problems, or even one of the major story that grabbed the attention of people along the region. Amna?
Yes, that's true. I mean, of course, Tunisian, there is a union of Tunisian journalists, which is very powerful. It's also, that's also something that we need to highlight when talking about the Tunisian scene, you know, like scene in terms of human rights, the human rights scene. There is a very thriving civil society and also unions who are very ferociously fighting for the rights of people. In the absence of, you know, like strong reforms, in the absence of a constitutional court that is normally supposed to protect rights, in the absence of a judiciary who is normally the saver and the guarantor of rights and freedoms, all this does not exist. But what we have is really this very thriving civil society and unions who are fighting very strongly against any backsliding on rights.
Okay, Manuel, the non-governmental organization Reporters Without Borders has registered more than 100 attacks on journalists inside Tunisia, specifically on journalist freedom, including censorship by their own directors and not even by the regime, and attacks by the police throughout this year. How do you view that? I mean, when they speak about more than 100 attacks on journalists, these journalists who, according to international conventions, they have certain rights. But how do you view this aspect? Is it dangerous to an extent when comparing it to other, because you were speaking about rights of freedom of journalists in different countries in comparison to what's happening in Tunisia?
When you tell this enormous number of 100, we have always to say that we speak about the post-revolutionary Tunisia, that we don't speak about the Ben Ali era. And of course this is deeply concerning. It's deeply concerning what takes place, and what our interview part, Amna, what she was saying is completely right, because the problem I see is right now that when we speak about the post-revolutionary Tunisia, in the mainstream society in Europe and in the West generally, everybody was cheering for that revolution. And I think if you make a referendum or a poll among in France, in Germany, or wherever, the people will tell you, now it's everything okay. Look, the freedom is established, and now they had a democratic election and so on. So I see one concerning point I see right now is that the lobby for those journalists became, because we think now it's everything all right, became smaller. Of course, we have those NGOs now taking care and campaigning for these. But I miss still until now, where are the governments which were criticizing Ben Ali? They are right now silent. They don't say anything. So this is a change of the situation, and we have this hypocrisy in Tunisia itself, where the law is made, but even the government doesn't respect that law.
Exactly.
So this makes the situation, in my opinion, more dramatic and more complex.
And even though they signed and ratified international conventions, we're speaking about that. Dear viewers, we'll take a final break today's episode. Stay with us.
Time. Variable. Event. The only constant variable in life is change. Broader perspective. Arguments and counter-arguments on our platform.
Global Insights. The globe on our platform.
Welcome back, dear viewers. Reporters Without Borders highlighted the freedom of information constitutes one of the foundations of a democracy. They also said the criminal code must be revised and amended in order to bring it into compliance with international standards. Reporters Without Borders also highlighted as public figures, government officials must accept media coverage of the public events in which they take part and must accept criticism. Finally, they said judges must act as guarantors of the judicial system's independence and must heed international standards. Manuel, to what extent is Tunisia today violating international laws when it comes to freedom of journalists and freedom of expression?
I mean, that situation that as journalist, you cannot rely on your law position you have as a journalist.
Yes.
We were saying it can happen to you, it can't happen to you. This is really, you cannot calculate what you are doing is not fitting at all to those international standards. And when you are put with a lawsuit in front of a court and the judge doesn't follow that international law or this new press codex, this new law, but follows the old one. He criminalizes you. We're criminalizing the work of journalists using crime paragraphs. It's a very, very old fashion to oppress journalists.
Yes. And that goes against crimes against humanity.
Crimes,
definitely.
Exactly. So it's done. It was done almost everywhere. In Turkey, for example, they used the terror paragraph against journalists. They criminalized them by that. So this is very, very common, and this takes place until today in Tunisia, just with the one exception that the world community is not anymore watching as strict on Tunisia as it used to be before, or this is my personal impression on this.
Actually, Amna, many say that the real problem behind the public prosecution is that it continues to rely, as they said, extensively on the penal code actually inherited from the regime of Zayn al-Abidin Ben Ali, from the ousted regime, under which press offenses can be punished by jail terms. So we're speaking about laws that are being inherited and not amended for the benefit of the journalists. How would you comment on this?
You know, actually, if the prosecutors were applying only Tunisian specific law for journalists, which is the press code, nobody, no journalist would go to jail for a peaceful expression of his opinion or for a work he has done in the course of his, you know, like job as a journalist.
So you're saying that the articles within So you're saying the articles within the Tunisian constitution is for the favor of the journalists, but there is a long application of these laws?
The constitution is not adopted yet. The new constitution is not adopted yet, but I'm talking more about the new press code, which was enacted in and promulgated in July 2011. This press code normally would preclude the application of other laws which are in contradiction with the press code. So normally the prosecutors should not apply the penal code for crimes, opinions voiced by journalists. They should
so
apply
Amna, here you're
code,
speaking.
and this press code protects the journalists normally. But the problem is that they are not applying it.
So you're speaking about Penal Code 115 and Penal Code 116.
There are plenty of other articles, such as Article 121, also in addition to those you cited, and which prosecutes and may bring to jail people for harming public morals and public order. This is one of the very sweeping, you know, articles that have no clear definition in the penal code. Public order and public morality has led also to the prosecution and charging of several people in Tunisia, including journalists.
Okay, from your perspective as a Tunisia office director at Human Rights Watch, have you registered more journalists being behind bars inside Tunisia, Amna?
If we compare to the Ben Ali era, of course not, because there are a few cases where journalists are actually behind bars, but there are many, many more cases where they are charged and prosecuted and brought to trial, but not in jail. So it's a situation where they are prosecuted but not sentenced yet, but the trial is pending, which puts them very much under pressure and put other journalists under pressure because they don't know whether they will face the same fate as their fellow journalists. And this is the situation we are in. It's not comparable to the Ben Ali era where there were several and tens of journalists behind bars, but it's still very dangerous and it raises a lot of concerns.
Okay, does Ennahda party gives access to Human Rights Watch to document the number of journalists being behind bars today inside Tunisia, Amna? Or HRW does not have access or are not allowed or disallowed to actually be in contact with these arrested journalists or even to have information about them?
Well, actually, it's there is quite an open relationship with the Tunisian government when it comes to Human Rights Watch or other, I think, international NGOs or national NGOs. We have been given like quite an extensive access to places of detention, especially places of pre-charge detention where people are arrested by the police, and we can do our job of monitoring the situation without being hindered by the government. And this is absolutely, there is absolutely no comparison, of course, with what existed under the Ben Ali regime, which has prevented in a very clear way the international and organizations and NGOs from accessing any place of detention.
Okay. Manuel, what does it mean today when a country or a society lacks freedom of expression and this allows journalists to actually be objective or even speak the way that they want to speak, of course, in accordance to professionalism, definitely. What does it mean when we still have a society that acts that way with journalists?
I mean,
have revolution actually achieved?
Frankly speaking, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, these are, we speak about basic stuff. With the freedom of speech, it's a little bit like pregnancy.
Yes.
You cannot be a little bit pregnant. You are pregnant or you are not.
Okay.
So if there are restrictions on freedom of speech, then there is no freedom of speech. Of course, there are different degrees, and maybe there is not just one single country existing with a full freedom of speech, because there might be some sinful restrictions when it comes to hate speech or whatever.
Yes.
But we are not talking about this right now. But the point is again that those regulations should be clear and obvious for anybody. Nobody should take the risk without seeing the risk.
Yes.
And the problem is right now, this is why I said it's more dramatic, in my opinion right now. With more dramatic, I don't mean that now more journalists are in prison or not. The problem is that a journalist doesn't know today anymore what fate he has to expect when he writes this or that article. Even when his colleague was writing a similar article before and nothing happened to him, it can happen to him the next week.
Exactly.
Because of the
because
same
there
reason.
are no certain laws that they can abide by, or certain laws that actually shapes their actions, or even judge them upon their actions.
And
yes.
one other really important point when it comes to those charges, what Amna said, what is really an important point, when you are a journalist and you have to go to trial,
Yes.
even when you are not sentenced, but frankly speaking, you are busy with your trial, you will not work a lot by that time.
Definitely.
It's a method of pressure and a method of silencing you. And these trials can go on for months. They cost money, they make you work a lot on your trial. Your files of the trial will grow,
Definitely.
but your articles, you will not write articles by that time. So this is also an important point, simply by, even when you get a sentence, or you are not sentenced, it means that you were not working or not properly working for a long time. And this is also a very important aspect.
And of course, it gives that kind of depression at one point to journalists when they're not able to do their job. Eventually, the most important part of their task is to be objective and to speak about those who cannot make their voices reach to others. It is said that press freedom, Manuel, was the most important achievement, according to some Tunisian journalists, of course, achievement of the January 14 Tunisian revolution. However, incidents on the ground, and as we highlighted several points, of course, from newspapers and from articles, proved directly the opposite. In your opinion, why was press freedom unable to be achieved along the success of the revolution, in your own opinion? Was it that hard for people to actually ask for at the beginning for that right?
Well, we have to see there the big picture. When it came to that revolution in Tunisia, we saw that the European Union, the West, and so on, they were all cheering to the revolution, as well as they were cheering afterwards, after the election, also when the Ennahda party was elected.
Okay.
What were the EU politicians saying? They were saying the best role model for the so-called Arabic Spring states is Turkey.
Yes.
Turkey is a democratic state governed by a moderate Islamist party, a moderate Sunni Islamist party.
Yes.
It is pro-Western, it is friends with Israel, it is a NATO member, it is very close to the European Union, even a candidate for membership in the European Union. So this is your role model, you shall follow up. But what we learn is, let us look to Turkey, how they treat journalists.
Yes.
Turkey is the prison of journalists in the world. Turkey is in the Freedom of Press Codex, it's on 155 of 179 states. Even China is better.
Yes.
Turkey is somewhere between black African dictatorships.
Yes, and actually we spoke about the subject and you participated in it, I do remember. Amna,
this is the role model.
Definitely. Amna, how vital would it be when the Committee to Protect Journalists collaborate with Reporters Without Borders and collaborate with the Tunis Center for Press Freedom and of course the Tunisian National Union of Journalists? How vital will this collaboration be to the rights given to journalists inside Tunisia?
I think the lobbying of Tunisian authorities and the international community through these connections between international NGOs fighting for press freedom and Tunisian unions and also associations working in this field is very vital for counter-attacking all these trends of prosecution against journalists and for the protection of Tunisian journalists from prosecution and trials and sentences. I think it is very important that there is a connection of this kind and that there is a lobbying for the change of the law, because that for me is the main point problematic which still exists and which makes this arbitrariness in which we live today when it comes to freedom of expression.
Okay. Manuel, if a legal framework is set, would you believe that Tunisia would be a better place for journalists?
As long as the government respects its own legal framework, yes.
So it's not only important to write them down, but also to make them applicable.
Exactly. It's not done with writing down a law. It's done with respecting that law. And when we see now, when the theoretical means for freedom of press and freedom of expression are there, and it is not respected by a lot of authorities, or when even the new government, the new Ennahda government, take advantage of this old, let me say, really bad habits of the Ben Ali government, then it's really concerning. Then it means there must maybe be much more than just to put down that law. Maybe you need also other people in responsibility for the freedom of media. Maybe you cannot take those people to do that.
Definitely, and of course with the collaboration of these organizations, international NGOs that we highlighted, and the collaboration of the civil society, we're speaking about international laws that can be also applied with officials, then definitely these journalists can shape or can pave the way for more freedom. Manuel, Orchsenreiter, it was really nice having you on our show, a journalist and editor-in-chief of Zuerst news magazine, and I wish you a safe flight to Syria. Thank you for being with us in Cases. Amna Guellali, the Tunisia office director at Human Rights Watch, thank you very much for joining us from Tunisia.
Thank you.
Dear viewers, that's all the time that we have. Thank you for watching Cases.